downfall of a dynasty can begin with something as simple as a single falsehood, and a throne can be lost because of a child without a rightful name. King Robert Baratheon brought ruin with him when he journeyed to Winterfell, though he was entirely unaware of the consequences his visit would set in motion. He traveled to the cold north with a singular purpose: to convince his most trusted and lifelong friend, Ned Stark, to become the hand of the king. On the surface, it was the greatest honor a lord could receive, but in reality, it was an invitation to a grave. The offer presented to Ned Stark was born from tragedy. The man who previously held the title of Hand of the King, Jon Arryn, had died. His end was disturbingly sudden, coming just after he had uncovered a deeply protected secret, one concerning the parentage of the royal children, a truth with enough power to shatter the stability of the entire kingdom. It became clear to those in the shadows that Jon Arryn had not died of natural causes. He had been silenced. Into this dangerous vacancy stepped Ned Stark, a man of the North, straightforward and unaccustomed to the subtle deceptions of court life. He lived by a simple code where honor and one's promise were unbreakable. So, when his king and friend from youth asked him to fill the now empty position, Ned felt he had no choice but to accept. It was his duty. His wife, Catelyn, felt a powerful sense of dread, a mother's instinct that warned her of the peril waiting for them in the south. She knew that King's Landing was a place where honorable men often met unhappy ends, a place where survival depended on playing a political game her husband neither understood nor respected. The arrival of the royal party confirmed her fears, bringing the capital's poisonous atmosphere to the gates of Winterfell. King Robert was accompanied by Queen Cersei, a woman whose piercing green eyes missed every detail and pardoned no offense. Their heir, Prince Joffrey, was a boy with the looks of a beautiful idol, but inside was everything but nobility. The younger royal children, Myrcella and Tommen, remained happily oblivious to the venom that flowed through their family's affairs. Traveling with them was the Queen's brother, Tyrion Lannister, known as the Imp. He was a dwarf who found his refuge in books and sharp-tongued jokes, all while observing the world around him with an insight that most people foolishly overlooked. Ned Stark's young son, Bran, was a boy who knew the ancient stones of Winterfell better than anyone. He found his freedom in climbing its high walls, seeing the world spread out beneath him. But one morning, his innocent climb led him to a sight he was never meant to see. From his high perch, he witnessed Queen Cersei locked in an intimate state with her own twin brother, Jaime. When Jaime Lannister met the boy's startled gaze, he made a ruthless decision to protect their secret. With a deliberate shove, he sent the child plummeting from the tower window. Miraculously, the fall did not kill Bran, but it left his body broken and his legs useless. As he lay in a deep sleep, hovering between life and death, a new threat emerged. A hired killer crept into his sick room, determined to silence the boy for good. The would-be murderer carried a dagger of exquisite make, its blade forged from rare Valyrian steel. He was about to finish the terrible job the fall had started, when help came from an unexpected source. With a surge of animal instinct, Bran's loyal direwolf launched itself at the assassin, defending its young master with a wild and untamed fury. The commotion brought Bran's mother, Catelyn Stark, into the fray. With nothing but her bare hands and a mother's desperation, she fought the armed man until the castle guards were alerted. She not only saved her son's life, but was left with a crucial piece of evidence: the assassin's priceless dagger. A clue that suggested the attack was not a random act of violence, but part of a much larger and more sinister plot. Before the household departed south, a quieter story unfolded in the shadow of the great hall. Jon Snow stood apart from the rest of the family. A bastard carrying the name Snow, he had no claim to lands and no future among noble titles. He felt the distance, especially in the presence of Catelyn Stark, who never truly accepted him. The journey to King's Landing offered him nothing. No purpose. No place. Inspired by his Uncle Benjen, Jon looked instead to the wall. A place where a man could build his own honor, free from the weight of his birth. When the time came to part, Ned Stark shared a final moment with the boy. Jon asked about his mother, the question that had followed him his entire life. Ned did not answer. Not yet. He promised him that the next time they met, he would tell him everything. It was a quiet promise, carried by a father who intended to keep it. They did not know it would be the last time they stood together. The journey south quickly exposed the deep rift between the Stark family's values and the brutal realities of the court. The trouble began when Prince Joffrey, full of arrogance, confronted Arya's friend, a butcher's boy, with a drawn sword. When Arya intervened to protect the defenseless boy, Joffrey turned his aggression on her. It was then that her direwolf Nymeria sprang to her defense, biting the prince and sending him screaming in a display of pure cowardice. When the incident was brought before the king, Joffrey's lies twisted the event into an unprovoked attack by the Stark girl and her friend. Queen Cersei, seeing an opportunity to assert her dominance, demanded a harsh penalty. With Nymeria having been chased away into the wilderness by a clever and desperate Arya, a substitute sacrifice was required. To satisfy the queen's demand for retribution, King Robert ordered Ned to execute Sansa's gentle and blameless direwolf lady. The act was a cold lesson in political appeasement, and for Sansa, it was the moment her fairy tale shattered. The world she had read about in songs, full of noble princes and just queens, was a fantasy. She began to see that her betrothal was not a dream come true, but an entry into a world where innocence was the first thing to be sacrificed at the altar of power. Amidst this court of open hostility and veiled threats, the most lethal player was not a warrior or a queen, but but a man who operated entirely from the shadows. Petter Baelish, known as Littlefinger, held the title of Master of Coin, but his real trade was in secrets. He had grown up alongside Catelyn Stark and had once loved her with a fierce passion before she was promised to Ned. That rejection fueled a lifetime of ambition. Over the years, he had quietly constructed an intricate network of spies and debtors, making himself indispensable and dangerous. Littlefinger was a master of patience and manipulation, and he was utterly without mercy in his pursuit of influence and control. In the capital, Ned began to understand the real reason for his predecessor's death. He discovered that John Arryn had spent his final days pursuing a dangerous line of inquiry, one that led him through blacksmith shops and into the pages of dusty old genealogy books. The trail revealed a simple but world-altering fact, hidden in plain sight for anyone who dared to look. For centuries, every true-born Baratheon had black hair. Yet King Robert's 3 children, Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen, were all golden-haired, bearing a striking resemblance to their mother and her twin brother, Jaime. The inescapable conclusion was that the heirs to the Iron Throne were not Robert's children at all, but the product of incest between the Queen and her brother. True to his nature, Ned chose the honorable path, which proved to be a fatal error. He confronted Cersei directly, revealing what he knew and offering her a chance to escape with her children before he informed the king. He expected her to be afraid, but instead he saw a cold, defiant fire in her eyes. She was a lioness cornered, and she made it clear that she would burn the entire kingdom down before she allowed anyone to threaten her cubs. But the king would never hear this devastating truth. Cersei, however, moved with speed and cunning that Ned failed to anticipate. King Robert found his greatest remaining pleasure in hunting, so she arranged for him to be given strong wine before he set off into the Kingswood. In his drunken state, the king was no match for the ferocious wild boar he cornered. The animal's tusk ripped his belly open, leaving him to die a slow and agonizing death over several days. And with his last breath, the truth of his children's parentage died with him. On his deathbed, King Robert entrusted the kingdom to his oldest friend, naming Ned Stark the regent, who would rule until Joffrey came of age. But Ned was trapped by his own conscience. Knowing that Joffrey had no rightful claim to the throne, he could not in good faith secure the boy's succession. In a bold and dangerous move, he altered the king's final decree. Instead of naming Joffrey as heir, he wrote in the name of Robert's stern younger brother, Stannis Baratheon, the next legitimate man in the line of succession. Ned's plan was to expose the Queen's treachery and restore lawful order, even if it meant plunging the realm into conflict. He made the fatal mistake of trusting the wrong man. Petter Baelish had sworn to provide Ned with the support of the City Watch, the armed force that controlled the capital, when the moment came for Ned to confront Cersei in the throne room, the promise of help vanished, replaced by the cold steel of a dagger at his throat. With the gold cloaks surrounding him, Ned Stark was arrested for treason under the command of the newly crowned boy, King Joffrey. Ned, seeing his younger daughter, Arya, hidden in the masses, gave a false confession, hoping the lie would spare his children. It did not save him. Most of the court, including Joffrey's own mother, expected the new king to show a calculated mercy, to exile Ned Stark, and demonstrate a capacity for wise rule. Instead, Joffrey gave the world its first true glimpse of the monster he was. From his seat on the Iron Throne, he commanded that his guards bring him Ned Stark's head. On the steps of the city's great sept of Baelor, Sansa was forced to watch as her father was brought before a roaring crowd. The great sword of his house, Ice, which had served his family for generations, was used to end his life. That single act of cruelty was the spark that set the entire continent ablaze. Hearing of his father's imprisonment, Robb Stark had already gathered his northern armies. Upon learning of the execution, the lords of the north renounced their allegiance to the Iron Throne and declared the 19-year-old Robb their king in the north. Though he had never commanded an army before, the young wolf moved with surprising speed and tactical brilliance, crushing a Lannister force in the Whispering Wood. In a stunning victory, he captured the most feared knight in the realm, Jaime Lannister, the Kingslayer. The legendary warrior found himself a captive of a boy leading his first campaign. But Robb was not the only one claiming kingship. The Baratheon house fractured from within. Stannis, the elder of Robert's two brothers, declared himself the one true king by right of law and birth. Meanwhile, Renly, the charming and popular younger brother, gathered a massive army with the backing of the wealthy House Tyrell and made his own claim, arguing that the strongest should rule. Instead of uniting against their common enemy, the two brothers prepared to make war on each other. And from his rocky islands, Balon Greyjoy watched the chaos, crowned himself once more, and plotted to attack the north while its armies were fighting in the south. The kingdom Robert Baratheon had held together by sheer force of personality was now coming apart at the seams. 5 men now laid claim to a crown, sparking what would become known as the War of the Five Kings. Houses that had stood united for generations were now sworn enemies. The Game of Thrones was no longer a matter of whispers and secrets in the halls of power. It was a war being fought with steel, and its price was being paid in blood. Far across the sea, a different kind of power was growing. Daenerys Targaryen had started as little more than a piece in her brother's desperate game to reclaim his family's throne. Viserys had sold her into marriage with Khal Drogo, the leader of a massive Dothraki horde, in exchange for an army. The marriage began brutally, but Daenerys found an inner strength she never knew she possessed. She learned the ways of the horse lords, earned her husband's love, and commanded the respect of a people who bowed to no one. Among her wedding gifts were 3 petrified dragon eggs, beautiful but lifeless relics from a forgotten age. One of King Robert's final acts, while he still lived, was to address a threat from across the narrow sea. Word that Daenerys Targaryen was pregnant had reached him, stirring the deep and old fear he held for her name. The ghost of Rhaegar Targaryen, the dragon prince who had stolen away his betrothed, Lyanna Stark, still lingered in his thoughts. The prospect of a new Targaryen heir, especially one born of the fearsome Dothraki, was a threat he could not tolerate. He had dispatched an order. The young queen was to be poisoned. As Daenerys' influence grew, so did Viserys' impatient rage. He had expected to be given a crown and an army immediately. When he finally threatened his sister at sword point in a sacred Dothraki city, Khal Drogo gave him the golden crown he so desperately craved, not on his head, but poured over it. The molten gold silenced Viserys' claims forever. As her brother died screaming, Daenerys watched calmly, realizing a fundamental truth. Fire cannot kill a dragon. In the bustling eastern marketplace, a wine merchant attempted to carry out the command, but was stopped by the watchful eye of Ser Jorah Mormont, the exiled knight sworn to protect Daenerys. When Khal Drogo learned of the plot to murder his wife and unborn son, his rage was boundless. In an act that would shatter Dothraki tradition, he swore an oath of vengeance, promising to lead his warriors across the sea and tear down the stone houses of the men in iron suits. The great Khal's promised invasion would never happen. A small cut from an enemy's blade, insignificant at first, festered in the oppressive heat of the plains. A slow poison crept through his veins, and the undefeated warrior found himself dying from a wound a child could have survived. Desperate to save him, Daenerys put her faith in a Lazarene witch, Mirri Maz Duur, who practiced the forbidden art of blood magic. The Migi agreed, but the cost of such magic was steep, governed by a simple, brutal law. Only death can pay for life. The ritual that followed was a cruel mockery of healing. It claimed the life of Daenerys' unborn child and left Khal Drogo a breathing but mindless shell, his spirit gone forever. Seeing the empty vessel her husband had become, Daenerys gave him one last gift, a peaceful end, smothering him with a pillow as his life slipped away. With her world in ashes, Daenerys made a choice that would redefine her destiny. She commanded a massive funeral pyre to be built for her husband. Upon it, she placed his body, her most treasured possessions, and the 3 petrified dragon eggs she had received as wedding gifts. She also bound Mirri Maz Duur and laid her among the treasures. The Migi had spoken of a price for the lives she had taken, and Daenerys would see it paid. As the structure was engulfed in a towering fire, she did the unthinkable. To the horror of her followers, she walked directly into the heart of the flames. fire that should have turned her to ash felt like nothing more than a warm embrace. When the sun rose on the cooled embers, the Dothraki witnessed a miracle. Daenerys sat there unharmed and naked, cradling 3 impossible creatures. Clinging to her skin were 3 newly hatched dragons, one the color of night and blood, one of cream and gold, and one of bronze and sea green. After more than 100 years of absence, dragons lived again. Far to the north, at the edge of the known world, Jon Snow was confronting different kinds of monsters. Having joined the Night's Watch, he was finding his place among the other outcasts who guarded the wall. Here, a man was judged not by his name, but by his actions. He proved his worth when he saved the Lord Commander Jeor Mormont from an impossible horror, a dead man who had risen to kill. The event was a chilling confirmation that the tales of the dead walking in the frozen forests were true. In gratitude, Mormont gifted Jon his own family's ancestral sword, Longclaw. The weapon was forged of Valyrian steel, one of the few remaining blades of its kind, and it would be desperately needed in the times ahead. News of his father's death was a blow that nearly shattered Jon's resolve. The pull of family, of a home he never truly had, was immense, and he prepared to desert his post to join his brother Robb's war. It was his new brothers, especially the gentle Sam Tarly, who reminded him of the oath he had taken. The Night's Watch served the realm of men, not the squabbles of kings. With a heavy heart, Jon chose to honor his vows. In the capital, real power was not in the hands of the boy on the Iron Throne. Queen Cersei ruled as regent, but her father, Tywin Lannister, was gathering his forces in the west, preparing to wage a war with cold, calculated efficiency. His grandson, King Joffrey, discovered a taste for cruelty. He found a pleasure in torment that other boys found in games. To torture his betrothed Sansa, he forced her to gaze upon her own father's head, mounted on a spike above the city gates, promising that her brother Robb's head would soon be placed beside it. The girl who had dreamed of becoming a queen was now learning the terrible reality of the role. A prisoner in a beautiful cage. This was the state of the realm as the seasons began to turn. A great winter was approaching, and with it came a sense that the old rules of conflict and power were breaking down. The war that had erupted with Ned Stark's death would not be a simple one. It would consume the entire continent. While the Baratheon brothers plotted their own destruction, Robb Stark was proving that his father's blood ran strong within him. The young wolf was not yet 20, but he led his armies with the confidence of a veteran commander, winning a string of decisive victories against Lannister forces. His direwolf, Grey Wind, was a terror on the battlefield, a gray shadow that tore through the ranks of his enemies. The lords of the north saw their young king's skill and ferocity and knew their rebellion was in capable hands. But winning on the battlefield is not the same as winning a war. Robb, still believing in reason and honor, sent peace terms to King's Landing. He asked for the North to be recognized as an independent kingdom, and for the safe return of his sisters. In the Red Keep, Queen Circe merely laughed at the message. She had no intention of negotiating with rebels, not while her father was assembling the might of the Westerlands to crush them completely. While armies clashed in the fields, a different kind of battle was being waged in King's Landing. One of whispers, secrets, and knives in the dark. Tyrion Lannister had been sent to the capital to act as Hand of the King in his father's stead. He arrived to find a court run by paranoia and incompetence. With sharp intelligence, he set about trying to clean a house that was rotten from the inside out. He dismissed the corrupt commander of the city watch, sending him to the wall. He exposed the Grand Meister as a spy for his sister, Circe, and had the old man tossed into a dungeon. He even outmaneuvered Circe by arranging a marriage alliance that sent Princess Myrcella to Dorne, a move designed to secure the southern border. Each of Tyrion's clever efforts to stabilize the throne only deepened his sister's suspicion and hatred. Circe saw his competence not as a benefit to their family, but as a direct threat to her own power. She could not grasp that her brother was desperately trying to save them from the consequences of their own actions. In the viper's nest of the Red Keep, wisdom was often mistaken for treason. Meanwhile, King Joffrey's sadistic nature festered. The boy king found endless amusement in tormenting those who could not fight back during a riot brought on by starving commoners. Joffrey's carelessness nearly got Sansa Stark torn apart by the mob. She was saved only by the intervention of Sandor Clegane, the Hound, a man whose own face had been disfigured by fire at the hands of his brother. The Hound understood monsters better than anyone. He served the Lannisters, but he harbored no illusions about them. And in Joffrey, he saw a cruelty that dwarfed even his brother's brutality. For her part, Sansa was forced to master a new kind of strength, the art of survival. The girl who had dreamed of storybook queens learned that a crown could be just another shackle. She smiled through Joffrey's abuses and feigned gratitude for his torments, learning to build a wall inside herself where she could remain unbroken. In the south, the House of Baratheon was busy destroying itself. Stannis, Robert's older brother, was a man forged from iron and duty. He had spent years serving a brother he viewed as unworthy, and now believed the throne was his by every law of succession. He knew the truth of Joffrey's birth and intended to see the pretender removed. Stannis, however, was not relying on law alone. He had embraced a new faith, following a red priestess named Melisandre. She was a woman from the Shadowlands of Ashai who saw visions in fire and spoke of a coming battle between light and shadow. She promised him victory, but her methods were drawn from a source far older and more unsettling than any of the 7 gods. His younger brother, Renly, chose a different path. Renly believed the crown belonged to the man who could actually hold it. Through his marriage to Margaery Tyrell, he he secured the allegiance of the Reach, the wealthiest and most populous of the Seven Kingdoms. With a massive, well-fed army at his back, he declared himself king, dismissing his brother's legal claim as irrelevant. Catelyn Stark, seeking to forge an alliance against the Lannisters, rode to Renly's camp and found him treating the coming war as if it were a grand journey. He had just named the formidable Brienne of Tarth to his personal guard after she defeated some of the finest knights in the realm in open combat. Catelyn pleaded with the brothers to set aside their differences, but their pride and ambition had grown too large for compromise. Their final meeting, held at the ancient castle of Storm's End, was not a negotiation, but an ultimatum. That night, Melisandre unleashed a power that had no place in the world of men. She birthed a living shadow, a creature of smoke and cold that slipped through the walls of Renly's command tent. Brienne was arming her king when the thing appeared and drove a blade of darkness into his heart. In the chaos that followed, the guards found Brienne alone with the body, his blood on her hands. She would have been cut down for a kingslayer had Catelyn not intervened, allowing them both to escape into the dawn. With Renly's death, his vast army fractured. Many of the lords, fearing Stannis and his sorceress, bent the knee to him, but the powerful Tyrells would not forget the slight. Stannis had offered them nothing, and their loyalty was not so easily won. As for Brienne of Tarth, having lost the king she had sworn to protect, she pledged her sword to Catelyn Stark, vowing to serve her until the day she died. As the great houses of the Greenlands were consumed by their own conflicts, another player made his move from the sea. On the Iron Islands, Balon Greyjoy had nursed a bitter grudge for a decade. Ever since Robert Baratheon had shattered his first rebellion and taken his last surviving son as a hostage, the sting of that decade-old defeat had never faded. Seeing the mainland tearing itself apart, the old Kraken saw his moment for vengeance. He crowned himself king, not of a unified realm, but of salt and rock, and prepared to pay the iron price for the North while its protectors were away. In a move born of brotherly trust and disastrous misjudgment, Robb Stark sent Theon Greyjoy home to negotiate an alliance. After 10 years in Winterfell, Theon was more Stark than Greyjoy in manner and thought. A friend so close to Robb that his status as a hostage was long forgotten. But back in the grim halls of Pike, he was met not with a father's embrace, but with contempt. Balon looked at his son and saw a stranger dressed in the clothes of his enemies, softened by their ways. He saw a wolf, not a kraken. When Theon presented Robb's offer, Balon dismissed it with scorn. The Ironborn would not beg for what they could take by force. Theon was faced with an impossible choice: remain loyal to the boy he considered a brother, or earn the respect of a father who saw him as a Stark pet. Desperate for his father's approval, he chose blood. His first mission was to prove his worth. He was given a few ships and a task to hurt the Starks where they were most vulnerable. He used the very knowledge he had gained as a member of their family to orchestrate its downfall. With only a handful of men, Theon exploited his intimate familiarity with Winterfell's defenses and seized the ancient castle in a single night. Bran and Rickon Stark woke to find their home occupied and their trusted friend transformed into their conqueror. Theon declared himself Prince of Winterfell, but the northern folk saw only a traitor. When the castle's master at arms, Sir Roderick Castle, defied him, Theon felt compelled to make an example. He executed the old man in the courtyard, a clumsy, brutal act that sealed his reputation, not as a conqueror, but as a butcher. His hollow victory was short-lived. The two young Stark princes, aided by the wildling woman Osha and the gentle giant Hodor, vanished into the castle's secret passages. Frantic to maintain control, Theon committed an unforgivable atrocity. He murdered 2 farm boys and passed off their charred remains as those of Bran and Rickon. The lie was meant to crush the North spirit, but it only hardened their resolve against him. His own men began to see him as a liability, and when northern forces arrived to retake the castle, they knocked him unconscious and surrendered him rather than die for his doomed ambition. The news of Winterfell's fall and the supposed murder of his youngest brothers struck Robb harder than any Lannister blade. It was a strategic disaster, forcing him to divert men to deal with the Ironborn threat. But the personal betrayal was a deeper wound that changed the young king. This cascade of tragedies also pushed his mother, Catelyn, to a desperate act. With her daughters held captive in King's Landing, Sansa a plaything for Joffrey's cruelty, and Arya missing, she saw only one path to their salvation. The one piece on the board she could move was their most valuable prisoner, Jaime Lannister. In the dead of night, acting without her son's authority, she freed the Kingslayer. She entrusted him to the care of Brienne of Tarth, who swore to escort him to the capital in exchange for his oath to return the Stark girls. It was a decision made from a mother's heart, but for Robb's bannermen, it was an act of treason. Lord Rickard Karstark, who had lost 2 sons to Jaime's sword, was enraged. Catelyn's gamble may have been for her children, but it created a bitter division within Robb's own camp, a wound that no victory on the battlefield could heal. It was during this time that Littlefinger, ever the opportunist, used the chaos following Renly's death to broker a powerful new alliance. He convinced the wealthy House Tyrell to pledge their loyalty to the Lannisters, sealing the deal with a proposal for Joffrey to marry the newly widowed Margaery Tyrell. This pact brought a flood of much-needed food and soldiers to the capital, just as a new threat was sailing for its shores. Stannis Baratheon, believing himself the one true king, had assembled the largest naval fleet Westeros had seen in years. His ships filled the horizon as he advanced on King's Landing. Determined to take his throne by force, Tyrion, preparing the city's defense, had unearthed a terrifying secret weapon left over from the reign of the Mad King. Vast caches of wildfire hidden beneath the city. This volatile green substance could burn on water and was nearly impossible to extinguish. The Battle of the Blackwater was decided in a single horrific night. Tyrion launched a lone, unmanned ship filled with wildfire directly into the heart of Stannis' fleet. When it was struck, a monstrous green inferno erupted, turning the Blackwater into a boiling cauldron and the night sky into a ghastly daylight. Hundreds of ships were consumed in an instant, and men burned in the water. Yet Stannis was a man made of iron. Undeterred, he led his surviving forces ashore and began a relentless assault on the city walls. As the battle raged, Joffrey revealed his true nature, fleeing the front lines to hide in the castle, abandoning his men. In his absence, it was Tyrion who rallied the defenders. The dwarf, who had been scorned his entire life, led a desperate charge, showing more courage than the king he served. The Hound, his old trauma of fire reawakened by the wildfire, finally broke and deserted his post, though not before offering to take Sansa away from the carnage. Stannis' forces breached the gates and poured into the city. Just as it seemed King's Landing was lost, a new army appeared on the field. Tywin Lannister and the Tyrells had arrived. Their fresh troops smashed into Stannis' exhausted soldiers, crushing his army and forcing the would-be king into a desperate retreat. Tyrion awoke from the wounds he sustained in the fighting to a changed city. His father, Tywin, was being celebrated as its savior, while his own pivotal role was quickly being erased from the story. The Game of Thrones simply resets, with new players in key positions. Far from the great battles and political schemes, we're setting the stage for a new kind of conflict, one that would obey none of the established rules. Arya Stark's journey was a descent into a world stripped of honor, no longer the high-spirited daughter of a great lord. She became a boy named Ari, traveling north with a grim company of recruits for the Night's Watch. Her path led her away from safety and straight into the fortress of Harrenhal, a place where Lannister soldiers treated their captives as playthings. By a twist of fate, she found herself serving as a cup-bearer to Tywin Lannister himself, the very man waging war against her family. It was there she learned a new kind of power. An enigmatic assassin from Braavos, Jaqen H'ghar, owed her a debt of 3 lives for saving him from a fire. Arya used this gift to eliminate her tormentors and paved the way for her escape. As a parting gift, Jaqen H'ghar gave her a small iron coin and a phrase from his homeland: Valor Morgulais. All men must die. For a girl who was compiling a list of people who deserved that fate, it was a promise. Hundreds of leagues to the north, Jon Snow was engaged in a colder struggle with his identity. Beyond the Wall, the Night's Watch expedition encountered Craster, a wildling who maintained a grim pact with the creatures of the forest, sacrificing his own newborn sons to the White Walkers to ensure his survival. Sent on a scouting mission deeper into the mountains, John's party captured a wildling spearwife named Ygritte, a woman whose fierce belief in freedom challenged everything he had been taught about duty and rules. When they were in turn captured by a wildling war party, John's commander, the legendary ranger Corin Halfhand, forced John into an unthinkable act. To convince the wildlings that John had truly abandoned his vows, Corin Halfhand made his subordinate kill him. This sacrifice embedded John among his enemies as a spy, leaving him torn between the oath he had sworn and the people he was beginning to understand. Not far away, his friend Sam Tarley made a discovery that would prove valuable. A cache of blades made from dragonglass, a forgotten weapon against a forgotten enemy. His discovery was immediately overshadowed as he watched the army of the dead. A tide of whites, led by the White Walkers, marched south. The real war was coming, and the living were not ready. Across the sea, Daenerys Targaryen was learning that being the mother of dragons did not automatically make one a queen. Her small band of followers dwindled as they journeyed through the desolate Red Waste, their survival dependent entirely on her resolve. They found a temporary haven in the opulent merchant city of Karth, a place of welcoming smiles that concealed daggers. The city's powerful merchants offered her gilded cages. One sought her hand in marriage for status, while a brotherhood of warlocks coveted her dragons for their magic. When the warlocks stole her children, Daenerys showed the world she was no longer a frightened girl to be bartered. She walked into their magical stronghold, the House of the Undying, and faced down visions of her past and future. A ruined throne room dusted with snow, her dead husband, and the son she never held. In the end, the fire from her dragon, Drogon, freed her and reduced her enemies to ash. She emerged a changed woman, one who dealt with the treachery of her hosts by locking them in their own empty vaults to die. With their ships and a newfound ruthlessness, she prepared to begin her own conquest. Every action in the capital sent waves across the world, and every death in the War of the Five Kings altered the game in unpredictable ways. Dragons were alive again, and a true winter was descending from the north. These were forces beyond the control of any king. The great wheel was turning faster, crushing more people with every rotation. The war had already been raging for 2 years, when a single event proved how completely the old rules had been broken. It would happen at a wedding feast, and it would be remembered as a night of betrayal that would stain the history of the realm for generations. For all his brilliance on the battlefield, Robb Stark's reign was undone by his own heart. The young wolf had won every battle, but 2 crucial decisions would lead to his downfall. The foundation of his rebellion began to crack when Catelyn freed Jaime Lannister. That act of a desperate mother became a catalyst catalyst for dissent, resulting in the rage of Lord Rickard Karstark. Having lost 2 sons to the Kingslayer's sword, Lord Karstark saw Catelyn's act as a betrayal. Consumed by grief, he took his vengeance on 2 captive Lannister boys, children who had never seen a battle. He had them murdered in their sleep, an act that forced Robb into an impossible position. He was faced with a choice between political necessity and the rigid honor he inherited from his father. To pardon Karstark would keep his army intact, while betraying the justice he was fighting for. In the end, he chose honor. In front of his wavering lords, Robb Stark took Karstark's head himself. In that moment, he proved he was his father's son, a man who would do what was right, even if it led to his own destruction. With the Karstark forces marching home, Robb's army was weakened. He needed new allies, which forced him to confront his other mistake. In marrying Talisa Maegor for love, he had broken a vow to wed a daughter of House Frey. Now, he had to go to Walder Frey, the Lord of the Twins, and beg for forgiveness. The old lord held a king's fate in his hands, and he savored Robb's humiliation. A new pact was forged. Robb's uncle, Edmure Tully, would marry a Frey girl to heal the rift. The king in the north would publicly apologize, and the alliance would be restored. It all seemed a reasonable price to pay. What no one in Robb's party knew was that Walder Frey had already accepted a lucrative offer from Tywin Lannister, paid in blood and revenge. The wedding feast began in celebration. The great hall rang with music and laughter, and wine flowed freely among the guests. For a few hours, it seemed as though old wounds had healed and the alliance had been mended. Then the musicians changed their tune. Catelyn recognized the melody instantly. The Rains of Castamere, the song of Lannister dominance, a hymn of annihilation. Then her eyes fell on Roose Bolton, and her blood ran cold. Beneath his robes, he wore armor. By the time the dread fully settled in her stomach, it was already too late. The doors were barred. The trap was sprung. The musicians raised crossbows and unleashed a volley of bolts into the northern lords. Robb was struck multiple times. Talisa, his pregnant wife, was stabbed in the stomach. The men who had followed the young wolf from victory to victory were cut down where they sat, their wine cups still in hand. Amidst the chaos, Catelyn seized Walder Frey's young wife, pressing a knife to her throat. Her voice broke as she pleaded for them to let Robb go. The old lord simply shrugged. He could always find another wife, he said. Roose Bolton stepped forward and drove a dagger into his king's heart. The Lannisters send their regards. Catelyn cut the young wife's throat. Then she stood there amid the slaughter, motionless and hollow. Moments later, a Frey blade found her throat as well. Her last sight was of men desecrating her son's body. They severed Robb's head and sewed the head of his direwolf gray wind in its place. A grotesque effigy paraded as a message to the whole of Westeros. This is what becomes of wolves who dare challenge lions. The young wolf was dead, and his rebellion drowned in a river of wine and blood. While the wars of Westeros were fought over land and titles, Daenerys Targaryen was waging a war for the very soul of a civilization. The irony was immense. A woman who had been sold into marriage like livestock now sailed into the heart of the slave trade to purchase an army. Her destination was Ostapor, a city whose wealth was built on the systematic torture of children to create the perfect soldiers, the Unsullied. Their spirits were broken in childhood, so their bodies could become perfect weapons. Warriors who felt no fear and obeyed any command. Daenerys played the part of a naive foreign girl, offering one of her priceless dragons in exchange for their entire army. The slave masters, blinded by greed, saw only a fool to be exploited, never suspecting that the silver-haired girl understood their high Valyrian tongue better than they did. The moment she spoke the language of old Valyria and gave her first command to the Unsullied, the entire balance of power in the city shifted. The discipline that had made them perfect slaves now made them perfect liberators. At her word, 8,000 warriors turned on their former masters. As Drogon's fire incinerated the lead master, the woman who had once walked out of a fire with 3 infant dragons now stood as a conqueror, commanding an army of fire and blood. She did not command their loyalty. She offered them a choice. She asked if they would fight for her as free men, and the breaker of chains found her army. As she marched through the gates, the thousands of slaves she had liberated chanted a single word: Mesa. It was the old Giscari word for mother. They lifted her onto their shoulders in a sea of hands, a queen born not of blood right, but of liberation. Yet ruling is a far more complicated art than conquering. She sought to break a wheel that had been grinding people into dust for centuries. A task that would demand more than just dragons and righteous anger. At the same time, in the desolate lands north of the Wall, the institution designed to protect the realm was consuming itself. The disastrous Great Ranging had ended with the army of the dead routing the living. The few survivors who staggered back to Craster's Keep were hollow-eyed men, broken by hunger, fear, and the sight of their true enemy. Discipline collapsed, and a brutal mutiny erupted. Lord Commander Mormont was murdered by his own men, dying on the dirt floor of a wildling's hut. The Night's Watch, the shield of the realms of men, had shattered itself. Amid the slaughter, Sam Tarly escaped with Gilly and her newborn son, fleeing south into the frozen wilderness. There they were confronted by a creature from Nightmare, a White Walker, come to claim the child. In that moment, Sam, who had spent his life as a self-proclaimed coward, found a strength born of desperation. He lunged forward with a simple dagger made of dragonglass and plunged it into the creature. The walker, an enemy seemingly immune to steel, shattered into 1,000 shards of ice. The fat, bookish boy, who had been mocked his entire life, had just discovered the key to fighting the coming night. The news of the Red Wedding spread like a sickness across the 7 kingdoms. A story of a victory so complete and so monstrous that it felt like a violation of the natural order. Tywin Lannister had achieved what his armies on the field could not. In a single evening, he had destroyed the Northern Rebellion without risking a single one of his own men. Yet this triumph was built on a foundation of sacrilege by orchestrating a slaughter under the guise of a wedding feast. Walder Frey had shattered the sacred tradition of guest right, the ancient law that protects any who have shared bread and salt beneath a host's roof. It was a victory that would forever be cursed, a stain that could never be washed away. As a reward for their treachery, Tywin's allies were granted the lands and titles of the men they had murdered. Roose Bolton was named the new Warden of the North, and the flayed man banner of his house was soon raised over castles that had belonged to the Starks for thousands of years. While the father secured his new domain, his illegitimate son Ramsay Bolton had been perfecting his own methods of control. His prisoner, Theon Greyjoy, became the subject of his cruelty. Ramsay systematically broke the Ironborn prince, flaying strips of his skin and carving away pieces of his identity, until the arrogant young man who had once called Robb Stark brother was gone, replaced by a terrified, hollow shell of a person named Reek. To formally end the Greyjoy threat, Ramsay sent a piece of Theon to his father, a gruesome message that caused Balon Greyjoy to withdraw his forces from the north entirely. Back in King's Landing, the Lannister victory was celebrated with feasts, but the real work was just beginning. Tywin Lannister, now the undisputed master of the political game, moved to secure his family's hold on power through a series of strategic marriages. These were not unions of affection, but political chains designed to bind potential rivals and claim valuable territories. His son Tyrion would be forced to marry Sansa Stark, giving the Lannisters a direct claim to Winterfell and the North. His daughter, Queen Cersei, would be betrothed to Sir Loras Tyrell, cementing the critical alliance with the powerful House of the Reach. In Tywin's new order, personal feelings were a weakness. Only power and legacy mattered. For Sansa Stark, this new arrangement was the final cruel twist in her nightmare. She learned of her mother's and brother's brutal murders while trapped in the Red Keep. A prisoner living under the pretense of being an honored guest. The wedding she was forced into was not the fairy tale she had once dreamed of, but another set of bars on her gilded cage. Her new husband, Tyrion, showed her what kindness he could, but his compassion was a small comfort in the face of her overwhelming grief and powerlessness. At their wedding feast, King Joffrey took a twisted delight in tormenting his new aunt. He promised her that her brother Rob's head, which was being sent from the twins, would be her wedding present. It was a promise of such cruelty that it revealed the true depth of the monster wearing the crown. Even as the Lannisters celebrated, new players and simmering vendettas were arriving in the capital, promising to disrupt their carefully laid plans. Prince Obrienne Martell of Dorne came to King's Landing for the royal wedding, but his true purpose was vengeance. For years, he had harbored a burning hatred for the men responsible for the brutal murder of his sister, Elia, during the final days of Robert's rebellion, and he had finally come to collect his debt. At the same time, Jaime Lannister returned to the city, a changed man. He had lost his sword hand, saving Brienne of Tarth, and in doing so had discovered a capacity for honor he never knew he possessed. But King's Landing had no memory for such sacrifices. His father, Tywin, saw him only as a crippled heir, and his sister, Cersei, had grown distant and cold. The man who had once saved the city was now treated as a broken relic. The unlikely bond Jaime had forged with Brienne had awakened something in him. He had acted out of pure decency, not for political gain or family loyalty, and the experience had left a permanent mark. But the capital was no place for noble intentions. New alliances were constantly being forged, and old enemies were always waiting in the shadows, sharpening their blades for the next move in the endless game. Far from this world of courtly intrigue, Arya Stark was learning a much harder set of lessons. After escaping the Brotherhood without banners, she had been captured by the Hound, Sandor Clegane. Seeing a valuable prize, he planned to ransom her to her family at the Twins, hoping the reward would be enough to let him disappear forever. They arrived not to an army camp preparing for a wedding, but to a charnel house. From a distance, Arya was forced to watch as Frey soldiers paraded the desecrated body of her brother. His direwolf's head, grotesquely sewn onto his shoulders. The sight of this ultimate mockery shattered something inside her. As they fled the scene, they came across a group of Frey men at arms, drunkenly boasting about their part in the slaughter. The girl who had once struggled with her sword lessons walked up to them, her own blade needle in her hand, and took her first life. There was no hesitation, no remorse. She was no longer a child playing at war. She was becoming a weapon, forged in grief and rage. Meanwhile, her brother Bran was on a journey of a different kind, one that would take him beyond the edge of the known world. Though his legs were broken, a different power was awakening within him. He discovered he could project his consciousness into the minds of animals, seeing the world through their eyes. Jojen Reed, his mysterious young guide, explained that he was a warg, a person with a rare and ancient ability. But he was something more, a greenseer, capable of seeing into the past and future through visions. A mysterious three-eyed raven was calling to him from the lands beyond the wall, and Bran knew he had a destiny to fulfill. On their northward path, they passed through the haunted ruins of the Night Fort, where they had a chance encounter with Sam Tarley. Sam, traveling south with Gilly and her baby, begged Bran to come to Castle Black, where his brother Jon could offer him protection. But Bran, who had spent his life being protected, was determined to follow his own path. Sam provided them with dragonglass daggers and showed them a hidden passage through the wall. As they stepped into the true north, they left the world of men and their wars behind, heading toward a realm of ancient magic and unimaginable dangers. His sworn brother, Jon Snow, made his own return to Castle Black, not as a hero, but as a wounded survivor. The physical wounds the 3 arrows Ygritte had put in his back as he fled were nothing compared to the scars on his soul. He was haunted by the memory of killing his mentor Corin, Halfhand, an act of sacrifice required to maintain his cover among the wildlings. He was a man caught between his vows and his conscience, between the world that had raised him and the one that had shown him freedom. The war between the living and the dead was coming, and Jon found himself torn between 2 peoples who would need to unite to survive it. Not all deaths are equal. Some are a footnote in the story of a kingdom, while others are the moment that changes everything. The death of King Joffrey Baratheon was the latter. It came not on a battlefield, but in the middle of the most lavish wedding the capital had ever seen. A spectacle designed to showcase the Lannisters' absolute power and bottomless wealth. The celebration was a grand performance of their triumph, but Joffrey, true to his nature, could not resist turning the occasion into an instrument of personal cruelty. He staged a grotesque play featuring dwarfs, mocking the men who had died challenging his family's rule. A final humiliation for the defeated. He then turned his spite on his uncle Tyrion, forcing the man who had saved the city to serve as his cupbearer, pouring wine over his head in a final display of dominance. Justice, however, has a way of arriving unannounced. Moments after tormenting his uncle, Joffrey took a bite of pie and a sip of wine. The poison worked with terrifying speed. The boy king, who had terrorized the realm, was reduced to a clawing, gasping creature, his face turning a bruised purple as he choked to death in front of his new bride and his horrified court. In his final moments, his finger pointed toward Tyrion, and that single gesture was all his mother, Cersei, needed. Her grief, sharp and immediate, demanded a target, and her hated brother was the most convenient one available. In the chaos that followed, 2 critical moves were made in the shadows. Sansa Stark, the key to the north, vanished from the feast, taken away by Petter Baelish, who had been waiting for this exact moment. And before Joffrey's body was even cold, Tyrion Lannister was arrested for regicide, thrown into a dungeon to await a trial that would be nothing more than a show. What Cersei did not know was that the true architects of her son's death had been sitting at the high table, watching with quiet satisfaction. Olenna Tyrell, the sharp-witted matriarch from Highgarden, had no intention of allowing her granddaughter to be married to a monster. In a precise motion, she had taken a poisoned crystal from Sansa's hairnet, a piece of the murder weapon the girl had worn without knowing, and dropped it into Joffrey's cup. Littlefinger had supplied the poison and the plan. The Queen of Thorns simply delivered the final blow. Tyrion's trial was the political theater everyone expected. Witness after witness, coached and coerced, painted him as a scheming monster. The cruelest blow came from Shae, the woman he had loved and tried to protect. She stood before the court and spoke lies, each word a fresh wound in his heart. Realizing that the verdict had been written long before the trial began, Tyrion made one last desperate gamble, demanding his right to a trial by combat. To everyone's surprise, a champion stepped forward for him. Prince Oberyn Martell. But the Red Viper's fight was not for Tyrion. His purpose in the capital was not diplomacy, but vengeance. He sought justice for his sister, Elia, who had been murdered by Gregor Clegane, the Mountain, during the sack of King's Landing years ago. The duel that followed was a dance of death. Oberyn, with his poisoned spear, was a storm of speed and skill against the Mountain's brute force. He brought the giant down, calling for a confession, demanding justice. But his need for acknowledgement was his undoing. He got too close, and in his final moments, the dying Mountain crushed his skull, ending his quest in a spray of blood and bone. With his champion dead, Tyrion's fate was sealed. But he had one ally left, one he did not yet know about. His brother Jaime, now returned to the city, was a changed man. The loss of his sword hand had stripped away his arrogance, and he could no longer stand by and watch his family's cruelty consume them all. With the help of the spymaster Varys, he slipped into the dungeons and freed Tyrion from his cell. But Tyrion did not flee. Not yet. He took a different path, up through the Tower of the Hand, the seat of his father's power. There he found Shae in his father's bed. That sight, that betrayal, broke something in him that could not be repaired. He killed her. Then he found Tywin Lannister, the most powerful man in Westeros, in the most undignified of places. The great lion died on a privy, shot twice with a crossbow by the son he had always despised. Tyrion descended. Varys was waiting in the shadows, as he always was. He led Tyrion through the hidden passages of the Red Keep and down to the harbor, where a ship that would carry him across the narrow sea sat ready. Tyrion was sealed inside a crate and loaded aboard. There was nothing left for him in King's Landing, only a death sentence and a father's corpse. Then, as the ship prepared to sail, Varys heard the bells of the city beginning to toll. He understood immediately what it meant. He turned, walked back aboard the ship himself, because he knew in that exact moment that there was no going back for either of them. deaths of King Joffrey and his grandfather Tywin Lannister sent the Iron Throne into a violent spin. The pillars of Lannister power, one of brutal, unpredictable madness, and the other of cold, strategic genius, had been kicked out from under them in a single stroke. Cersei found herself trying to steer the ship of state through a storm, ruling as regent for her younger son, Tommen. But where Joffrey had been a storm of petty cruelties, Tommen was a gentle breeze. He was a kind-hearted boy who wanted to please everyone, a dangerous trait for a king. This gentle nature made him easy prey for a far more skilled player. Marguerite Tyrell, the Rose of Highgarden, wasted no time in charming the new young king. With soft words and warm smiles, she quickly became his confidant and queen, expertly winding him around her finger. Cersei could only watch in a state of growing fury as her own influence over her son evaporated, replaced by the subtle and unshakable power of her new daughter-in-law. The faces at the high table had changed, but the game for control of the throne continued without pause. For Jaime Lannister, the family's crisis was also a personal reckoning. Stripped of his sword hand and the identity that came with it, he was now adrift. His father had died despising him as a crippled failure. His sister love had grown cold and distant, and his brother was now a fugitive and a kinslayer because of his help. Amidst this ruin, Jaime clung to the one honorable thing he had left, a promise made to a dead woman. He had sworn an oath to Catelyn Stark to find and protect her daughters. To fulfill it, he armed Brienne of Tarth with a new sword of Valyrian steel, forged from the melted-down blade of Ned Stark's great sword. He named it Oathkeeper. A weapon born from an executioner's blade was now a guardian's shield, a symbol of the strange and winding path to redemption. Meanwhile, in the isolated fortress of the Eyrie, Sansa Stark was receiving a brutal education in the true nature of that game. Her rescuer, Petter Baelish, had brought her to her Aunt Lysa. But the sanctuary she hoped for was in fact a different kind of prison. Lysa Arryn was a woman consumed by a long, festering, paranoid love for Littlefinger. In a moment of crazed confession, she revealed a staggering truth to Sansa. It was she and Littlefinger who had murdered her husband, Jon Arryn, and then blamed the Lannisters. The entire war, the death of her father, the destruction of her family, the ruin of the kingdom, had all been born from this man's ambition and this woman's obsession. The revelation was horrifying. But Sansa's lesson was not yet over. When Lysa's jealousy spiraled into a murderous rage, she tried to push Sansa from the moon door, a hole in the floor that opened onto a 1,000-foot drop. Littlefinger intervened, but not to save his lover. He shoved Lysa to her death, whispering that he had only ever truly loved her sister, Catelyn. In the aftermath, Sansa was forced to make a choice. Instead of revealing the truth, she lied to the Lords of the Vale, confirming Littlefinger's story and securing his position as their ruler. It was her first truly calculated political move, an act of self-preservation that marked her transition from a pawn to a player. The girl who once dreamed of fairy tale queens was learning that survival sometimes required a crown of lies and hands stained with blood. While the South was consumed by courtly betrayals, a far more primal war was reaching its brutal climax in the frozen North. Mance Rayder, the king beyond the wall, had united 100,000 free folk into a single desperate host. They were not an invading army, but refugees, fleeing a far more terrifying enemy that was rising in the lands of eternal winter. Jon Snow, now returned to the Night's Watch, was caught in the middle. His time living among the wildlings had shown him they were not the savages of southern tales, but a people fighting for their very existence. He understood their plight, but his sworn duty was to the wall. The wildling assault on Castle Black was a masterful two-pronged attack that nearly succeeded. As giants on mammoths tried to smash through the main gate, climbers scaled the immense ice wall to strike the defenders from behind. The Night's Watch, outnumbered hundreds to one, fought with the ferocity of cornered animals. In the tunnel beneath the wall, a handful of brothers, led by Jon's friend Gren, made a final heroic stand against a charging giant, chanting their vows as they were crushed. Their sacrifice buying the castle precious time. During the chaotic battle in the courtyard, Jon came face to face with Ygritte. The woman he loved had him cornered, an arrow aimed at his heart. But for a fatal second, she hesitated. In that moment of shared memory, an arrow from Ollie, a young boy whose family had been killed by wildlings, found its mark in her back. Ygritte died in Jon's arms, whispering that they should have stayed in that cave, a small pocket of warmth and peace in a world of ice and war. Just as the defenders were about to be overwhelmed, a miracle arrived. Stannis Baratheon, acting on warnings of the northern threat, had brought his army to the wall. His disciplined knights and cavalry smashed into the disorganized wildling host, ending the battle in a decisive victory. Stannis, the grim and unyielding claimant to the Iron Throne, had saved the realm from an invasion the Southern Lords had dismissed as myth. In the aftermath, Jon, now respected for his leadership, convinced Stannis to spare the captured wildlings, arguing that every living person would be needed for the true war to come, the war against the dead. It was an act of mercy that would have profound consequences, a victory won not by taking lives, but by preserving them. But not all surrendered so quietly. Mance Rayder, the towering king beyond the wall, refused to kneel. He had led his people through ice and ruin, and he would not bend the knee to a southern king who had no claim over free folk. Stannis, unbending as ever, could not let the defiance stand. A king who shows mercy to those who spit on his crown invites only more contempt. He sentenced Mance to die by fire. As the flames rose, Jon Snow could not watch a man be tortured in the name of justice. He raised his bow and put an arrow through Mance before the fire could take him. It was a mercy and a message. Jon Snow did not answer to Stannis Baratheon. Meanwhile, Bran Stark and his companions finally reached the end of their own perilous journey. After traveling deep into the haunted forest, they found the cave of the Three-Eyed Raven, a place protected by ancient and powerful magic. Their arrival came at a great cost. Jojen Reed, the boy who had guided Bran and taught him of his powers, was killed by an army of whites just outside the entrance. It was the final sacrifice required to fulfill the prophecy. Inside the cave, they were saved by the last of the children of the forest, the ancient non-human race who had inhabited Westeros long before the first men arrived. They led Bran to his final teacher, the Three-Eyed Raven himself. He was not a bird, but an ancient man, so old that the roots of a massive weirwood tree had grown through and around him, merging him with the earth. He promised to teach Bran everything: how to see into the past, how to witness the present across vast distances, and how to understand the great web of destiny. But this knowledge would come at a price. The boy who was once Bran Stark would be transformed into something more and something less than human. In Meereen, Daenerys Targaryen was learning the hard lesson that sits on the other side of liberation. Conquering cities built on chains was one thing. Ruling them in the chaotic aftermath was another entirely. Almost immediately, a shadowy insurgency known as the Sons of the Harpy began a campaign of terror, murdering her unsullied soldiers in the dark of night. In an attempt to balance justice with retribution, Daenerys ordered the crucifixion of 163 of the city's masters, one for each of the slave children they had crucified along the road to the city. But such acts, however justified, only bred deeper resentments and created new generations of enemies. Her personal circle proved to be just as treacherous. The most painful lesson came with the revelation that Jorah Mormont, her most trusted advisor and protector, had originally been a spy, sending information about her back to her enemies in Westeros, though he had long since abandoned his mission and was now fiercely loyal. The initial betrayal was a wound that could not be healed. With a heavy heart, she exiled him, a decision that proved she could place the security of her reign above her own personal feelings. An even more heartbreaking choice awaited her. Her dragons, the source of her power, and her beloved children were growing wild and dangerous. After Drogon killed a farmer's young daughter, Daenerys knew she could no longer allow them to roam free. In an act that felt like a betrayal of her own nature, she lured Viserion and Rhaegal into the catacombs beneath her pyramid and chained them in the darkness. But Drogon, the largest and fiercest, sensed the trap and disappeared into the sky. She sat on her throne, a queen ruling a restless city, having imprisoned 2 parts of her own soul and lost the third. Her story was one of many threads in a larger theme was beginning to define the era. All men must die. The poison that killed Joffrey, the crossbow bolt that ended Tywin, and the spear that silenced Oberyn were all reminders that in the end, death is the only true victor in the Game of Thrones. New players simply step onto the board to take the place of the fallen, and the great wheel keeps turning, crushing lives beneath it. But a new, colder reality was dawning. Winter was no longer a distant threat. It was a promise that a far greater death was coming for everyone, regardless of what crown they wore. This was a truth that Cersei Lannister, in her own desperate game for power, failed to grasp. In King's Landing, she watched with mounting fury as Margaery Tyrell expertly manipulated her son, King Tommen, turning him into a willing puppet. Feeling her own power slip away, Cersei devised what she believed to be a master stroke. She would empower the city's religious zealots, a movement of sparrows led by a humble but intensely devout man, to bring down her rivals. She reinstated the Faith Militant, an ancient order of holy warriors, giving them the authority to enforce the laws of the gods. Their first targets were the Tyrells. Sir Loras was arrested for his homosexuality, and when Margaery lied to protect him, she too was imprisoned for perjury. Cersei savored her victory, believing she had found the perfect weapon, one that could destroy her enemies while leaving her own hands clean. But she had made a fatal miscalculation. The High Sparrow was not her tool. He was a man of unbending conviction, who believed that all souls, even royal ones, were equal before the gods. He knew of Cersei's own long list of sins: adultery, incest, her role in the last king's death, confessed to him by her own cousin and former lover, Lancel Lannister. The weapon she had unleashed turned on her. The Faith Militant arrested Cersei and threw her into a filthy dungeon. Her power, her name, her beauty, all of it was stripped away. To earn her freedom, she was forced to confess some of her crimes and atone. Her punishment was a walk of atonement, a ritual of ultimate humiliation. Shorn of her hair and stripped naked, she was forced to walk through the streets of the city she had once ruled, enduring the jeers and filth hurled at her by the common people. By the time she reached the safety of the Red Keep, she was a broken, bleeding figure. But those who looked at her and saw a defeated woman had no idea of the fire her humiliation had just stoked, or the vengeance it would one day unleash. In the north, the game was being played with a quieter, but no less brutal intensity, and Sansa Stark was once again its central piece. Petter Baelish, having secured his position in the Vale, now turned his attention to his ultimate prize, control of the North. His plan was to use Sansa as the key, arranging a marriage for her with Ramsay Bolton. He presented the alliance as a brilliant political maneuver, a way for Sansa to reclaim her home and avenge her family from within. Whether he was ignorant of Ramsay's true nature or simply indifferent to it, the result was the same. He delivered Sansa into the hands of a monster. Returning to Winterfell was a surreal horror. The home that held all her memories of safety and love was now a cold, menacing place, occupied by the very family that had orchestrated her brother's murder. Every hallway held a ghost, every corner a potential threat. Sansa tried to summon the resilience she had learned in King's Landing, but Ramsay was a different kind of evil. Joffrey had been a cruel child. Ramsay was an artist of pain. He revealed the full extent of his depravity on their wedding night, brutally assaulting her while forcing a broken Theon Greyjoy to watch. The experience was a new and deeper kind of nightmare, a violation that threatened to extinguish the last flicker of hope within her. While Sansa fought her personal war inside Winterfell, Stannis Baratheon was fighting a losing battle outside its walls. His march on the castle was a disaster from the start. A premature and vicious winter descended, trapping his army in deep snow, while Ramsay's guerrilla tactics bled his forces day by day. His men were starving and freezing, their morale collapsing. In this desperate situation, the Red Priestess, Melisandre, offered a terrible solution. She claimed the Lord of Light required a great sacrifice to turn the tide of the war, a sacrifice of king's blood. Stannis, a man who had always placed his rigid sense of duty above all else, was convinced to make the ultimate, unforgivable choice. He allowed his own daughter, the gentle Princess Shireen, to be burned alive at the stake as a sacrifice for victory. The act was so monstrous that it shattered his army. Half his men deserted overnight, unwilling to serve a king who would murder his own child. His wife, Celis, hanged herself in grief. The weather did break, but the victory he had paid for with his daughter's soul never came. His depleted, broken army was easily crushed by the Bolton cavalry. Stannis himself was found wounded in the woods by Brienne of Tarth. She had sworn an oath to avenge the death of his brother, Renly, and with a single swing of her sword, she executed the last of the Baratheon kings. The man who had sacrificed everything for a crown died alone in the snow, a grim testament to the corrupting nature of absolute conviction. Theon himself was a testament to Ramsay's cruelty. He had been so thoroughly tortured, both physically and psychologically, that the arrogant prince he once was had been completely erased, replaced by a terrified creature called Reek. Yet witnessing Sansa's nightly torment began to stir something long dormant within him. A flicker of the old Theon, the boy who had grown up a brother to the Starks, began to re-emerge. The breaking point came when Ramsay's jealous lover Myranda threatened to kill Sansa. In a sudden, decisive act, Theon broke free from his conditioning. He pushed Myranda from the castle ramparts to her death, and seizing the moment, helped Sansa escape. Together, they leaped from the high walls of Winterfell, plunging into the deep snow below, choosing a probable death over the certainty of life under Ramsay's roof. At the wall, Jon Snow was learning the loneliest truth of leadership. sometimes the right decision is the one that makes everyone hate you. As the 998th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, he made a choice that shattered centuries of tradition. He knew from first-hand experience that the true enemy was not the free folk, but the army of the dead that hunted them. He had seen the White Walkers and their power, and he understood a grim, simple arithmetic. Every wildling left to die north of the wall would be another soldier in the Night King's army. The only logical strategic choice was to bring them south, to unite all the living against the coming dark. But his brothers in the Watch, men who had spent their lives fighting wildlings, could not see past their old hatreds. They saw Jon's pragmatism as a betrayal of their sacred duty. The mission to the wildling settlement of Hardhome was meant to be a rescue, but it devolved into a massacre that proved Jon right in the most horrific way possible. The army of the dead descended on the settlement, a relentless wave of ice and death. In the chaos, Jon discovered that his Valyrian steel sword, Longclaw, could shatter a White Walker. But this small victory was immediately dwarfed by the spectacle that followed. With a simple, silent gesture, the Night King raised every person who had just fallen, their eyes opening to an eerie, unnatural blue. They were no longer wildlings. They were now part of the enemy. The few thousand who escaped with Jon were a fraction of those who had died, and their arrival at Castle Black was met with simmering resentment. Men like a lesser thorn saw only enemies being brought through their gates, a violation of everything they stood for. In Meereen, Daenerys was also learning that power creates as many problems as it solves. The Sons of the Harpy continued their guerrilla war, their nightly assassinations, a constant reminder that her new world order was fragile. In an attempt to appease the city's traditionalists, she agreed to reopen the fighting pits, a decision that nearly cost her everything. The event was a carefully planned ambush. The Sons of the Harpy rose from the stands surrounding her and her small retinue. She was saved first by the timely return of Jorah Mormont, whose loyalty had never truly wavered, and then by a far greater power. As if summoned by her desperation, Drogon descended from the sky, now immense and terrifying. He unleashed a torrent of fire that broke the assassins' ranks. In a moment that would become legend, Daenerys climbed onto his back and flew away from the chaos, becoming the first dragon rider the world had seen in over a century. Her spectacular escape, however, left her city in turmoil, and her advisors, including the newly arrived Tyrion Lannister, scrambling to maintain control. Drogon deposited her miles away in the vast grasslands of the Dothraki Sea, where she was immediately surrounded by a horde of warriors. The queen, who had commanded armies and flown on a dragon, was once again a captive, her fate in the hands of strangers. While Jon tried desperately to prepare the realm for a war no one believed was real, his own sworn brothers plotted against him. The betrayal was swift and brutal. Lured into the courtyard one night with a false report about his missing uncle, Jon walked into an ambush. One by one, the mutineers, including young Ollie, whose family had been killed by wildlings, plunged their knives into him, each whispering, "For the Watch." They believed they were saving their order from a traitorous commander, but in their fear, they had murdered the one man who truly understood the threat they all faced. Jon Snow, the bastard who had tried to bridge the gap between ancient enemies, bled out in the snow, struck down by the very men he was trying to save. Thousands of miles away, his sister Arya was engaged in a different kind of struggle for her identity. In the House of Black and White, the temple of the assassins known as the Faceless Men, she was learning that to become no one meant erasing every trace of Arya Stark. Her mentor, Jaqen H'ghar, taught her their philosophy: to be a servant of the many-faced god. One must be selfless, a vessel of death with no personal desires or history. She learned to lie, to change her face, to move through the world unseen. But she could never fully abandon the girl who still clutched the sword needle in secret, the girl who carried a list of names in her heart. When Sir Murren Trant, one of the names on that list, arrived in Braavos, she saw her chance. Abandoning her training, she used her new skills to infiltrate the brothel where he preyed on young girls and delivered a brutal personal vengeance. For this act of defiance, for choosing to be Arya Stark instead of no one, the Faceless Men punished her. They took her sight, leaving her blind and helpless on the streets of Braavos. A lesson designed to strip away the last remnants of her ego and pride. In the sun-scorched lands of Dorne, the fallout from Oberyn Martell's death was a slow, burning poison. While the patient Prince Doran counseled peace, his brother's lover, Ilaria Sand, and her warrior daughters, the Sand Snakes, craved a war of vengeance against the Lannisters. When Jaime Lannister arrived on a diplomatic mission to retrieve Princess Myrcella, he unknowingly walked into their trap. Ilaria played the part of reconciliation, but as she gave Myrcella a farewell kiss, she sealed the girl's fate with a subtle delayed action poison. On the voyage home, in a rare moment of vulnerability, Jaime confessed the truth to Myrcella, that he was her father. The princess responded not with shock or disgust, but with acceptance and love he had never known. For a fleeting moment, a sliver of hope appeared in the twisted story of their family. But then the poison took hold, and Myrcella died in her father's arms, a final brutal consequence of a feud that had started years before. The world seemed to be sinking into darkness. Jon Snow lay murdered at the wall. Cersei, though humbled, was nursing a simmering rage that promised future violence. Sansa had escaped one monster, only to be lost in the frozen wilderness. And all the while, the Night King's army grew with every casualty of the petty human wars. The Game of Thrones seemed to be grinding everyone down. But death is not always a final defeat. At Castle Black, Jon Snow's body lay on a table, his blood staining the floor. His few loyal friends, including Sir Davos Seaworth, stood a grim watch. Davos, a man of simple faith, had seen enough of the Red Priestess Melisandre's power to wonder if the end was truly the end. Melisandre herself was a broken woman. Her faith had been shattered by the defeat of Stannis. Her prophecies turned to ash. Beneath the glamour of her magical necklace, she was an ancient, weary soul. Yet, at Davos's urging, she agreed to try one last ritual. She washed Jon's wounds, cut his hair, and chanted the ancient words of her faith over his body. At first, there was only silence. Then, with a sudden, violent gasp, Jon Snow's eyes flew open. He was back. The man who had been murdered by his own brothers had been pulled back from the abyss. His resurrection was not just a miracle. It was an event that would fundamentally change the rules of the coming war. His first act upon returning to the world of the living was to dispense a final grim justice. Jon Snow executed the men who had murdered him. A lesser Thorn, Bowen Marsh, and the boy Ollie for their treason. His second act was even more profound. He removed his black cloak and handed it to his friend Ed, declaring that his watch had ended. The oath of the Night's Watch bound a man until death. Having died, he was now free. The bastard who had always sought a place to belong was finally unbound, able to choose his own destiny. That destiny arrived in the form of his sister, Sansa. Her escape from Winterfell and arrival at Castle Black was the first moment of true hope the Stark family had known in years. They had both survived unimaginable horrors, and in their reunion, they found a strength they had forgotten. Sansa, forged into steel by her suffering, was determined to take back their home. Jon, weary from betrayal and death, was reluctant to fight another war. But when a gloating letter from Ramsay Bolton arrived announcing he held their youngest brother Rickon captive, the choice was made for them. The ensuing conflict became known as the Battle of the Bastards. Jon and Sansa cobbled together an army from the few northern houses still loyal to their name, including the fierce little Lady Mormont, and a force of 2,000 wildlings led by Tormund Giantsbane. Men who followed Jon not out of duty, but out of respect. Ramsay's army was larger and better equipped, but his arrogance was his greatest weakness. In a sickening display of cruelty, he released Rickon, letting the young boy run across the open field toward his brother. Jon saw him and did not hesitate. He threw himself onto his horse and rode hard to meet him. But just as he closed the distance, an arrow buried itself in Rickon's back. The boy fell dead in the dirt, steps away from safety. Something in Jon broke. Without a word, without a signal, he spurred his horse forward, alone, charging straight at the entire Bolton army. His own forces watched in stunned silence as their commander rode headlong into a storm of arrows. The battle had not even begun. One by one the arrows came, and then all at once. His horse was struck and stumbled, throwing Jon to the ground. He rose slowly, battered and breathless, and looked up to see a wall of enemy soldiers closing in from every direction, a tide of shields and steel. There was nowhere to run. A marvelous sight that the tongue fails to describe. He drew his sword. One man against an army. This was his choice, to die on his feet, facing forward. Then, at the last possible moment, his own army surged in behind him, crashing into the enemy line and pulling him back from the edge of death. The battle devolved into a brutal, chaotic slaughter. Jon's smaller army was nearly swallowed, and he himself was almost suffocated under a rising pile of bodies. All seemed lost until the horns of the Knights of the Vale sounded. Sansa, in a shrewd and desperate move, had secretly secured the aid of Petyr Baelish. His cavalry smashed into Ramsay's flank, shattering his army and saving the day. Ramsay fled back to Winterfell, but a giant, with his last breath, broke down the castle gates. Jon beat Ramsay senseless in the courtyard, but left the final act of vengeance to his sister. Sansa, who had endured so much at Ramsay's hands, watched with a cold, quiet satisfaction as he was devoured by his own starving hounds. In the aftermath, the lords of the North, witnessing Jon's courage, declared him their new king in the North. The bastard had become a king, a leader to unite them against the coming winter. But even as he accepted his crown, a far more significant truth about his identity was being revealed. Beyond the wall, Bran Stark, now under the tutelage of the three-eyed raven, was journeying through visions of the past. He witnessed the truth of what had happened at the Tower of Joy decades earlier. His aunt, Lyanna Stark, had not been kidnapped, but had run away with Rhaegar Targaryen. She died giving birth to their son, whom she entrusted to her brother, Ned. Jon Snow was not Ned's bastard, but the secret legitimate son of a Targaryen prince and a Stark lady, the true heir to the Iron Throne. Bran's visions also revealed the origin of their greatest enemy. The White Walkers were not a natural evil, but a weapon created thousands of years ago by the children of the forest to fight the first men. But this knowledge came at a terrible price. During one vision, the Night King saw Bran and marked him, breaking the magical protections of the cave. The army of the dead swarmed their sanctuary. As they fled, the gentle giant Hodor sacrificed himself to block a door, his mind breaking under the strain of Bran's warging as the command, "Hold the door," echoed through time, becoming the only word he could ever say. Summer, Bran's direwolf, also died defending him. The boy who had set out to find answers was now the three-eyed raven, a being with immense power and a burden that was no longer entirely human. In King's Landing, Cersei Lannister was planning an apocalypse. The humiliation of her walk of shame had not broken her. It had tempered her rage into a weapon of terrifying focus. Her target was the great sept of Baelor, the center of her enemy's power, and her weapon of choice was the vast quantity of wildfire hidden beneath the city, a forgotten legacy of the Mad King. during the trial of Loras Tyrell, as all her rivals gathered in one place. The High Sparrow, Marguerite, Loras, their father, Mace, and hundreds of other lords and ladies of the court, Cersei enacted her revenge. She ignited the wildfire. The resulting green explosion vaporized the sept, and with it, every single person who had stood in her way. In one fiery, terrible moment, she had eliminated all of her enemies and cleared her path to the Iron Throne. But such a total victory comes at an unbearable cost. Her son, King Tommen, who had genuinely loved his wife, Marguerite, watched from a window in the Red Keep as the sept and his queen were consumed by green flames. In that instant, he understood the true nature of his mother's monstrosity. Quietly, he removed his crown, stepped onto the ledge, and fell to his death. With his suicide, the witch's prophecy that had haunted Cersei since childhood was finally fulfilled. All 3 of her children were dead, each a casualty of her own ambition and cruelty. With no rivals left to challenge her, Cersei Lannister, dressed in black leather like a harbinger of death, crowned herself queen of the 7 kingdoms. She sat on the Iron Throne not by right of birth, but by right of fire and fear. Jaime Lannister returned to the capital just in time to see his sister, the woman he loved, become the very thing he had killed the Mad King to prevent. She was a tyrant ruling over a kingdom of ashes, and he was complicit in her creation. While the South was being reshaped by fire, the North was being cleansed by ice-cold vengeance. Arya Stark, having left the faceless men behind, had returned to Westeros. She had learned their lethal arts, but had ultimately rejected their philosophy of becoming no one. She was Arya Stark of Winterfell, and she had a list to finish. Her first stop was the twins, the site of her family's most painful betrayal. Walder Frey, the architect of the Red Wedding, was celebrating his victory over his enemies. Arya, using the skills she had learned in Bravos, infiltrated his castle disguised as a servant girl. In an act of poetic justice, she killed his 2 sons, baked them into a pie, and served it to the unsuspecting old lord. Only after he had eaten did she reveal her true identity. A Stark returned from the dead to settle her family's debts. Then she drew a blade across his throat, the same way her mother's had been cut. The Red Wedding had been avenged, a promise kept by a girl who had never forgotten a single name on her list. The North remembers. Meanwhile, across the narrow sea, Daenerys Targaryen was forging the final pieces of her invasion force, not with diplomacy, but with a display of absolute power. The Council of Dothraki Calls, who had arrogantly presumed to condemn her to a quiet life of widowhood in Vys Dothrak, learned a fatal lesson about the nature of the woman they had underestimated. In a move of breathtaking audacity, she trapped them within their most sacred temple, barred the doors, and burned the entire structure to the ground. As the great wooden hall was consumed by flames, she emerged from the inferno, untouched and reborn in the eyes of the entire Dothraki nation. They saw not a foreign woman, but a goddess, and pledged their savage loyalty to her cause. Her return to Meereen was met with another challenge. The slave masters, emboldened by her absence, had launched a naval assault to reclaim their city. They were met not by the Unsullied, but by a force far more devastating. Her 3 dragons, now grown to fearsome size, descended upon the slavers' fleet. What followed was not a battle, but a slaughter. Dragon, Viserion, and Rhaegal turned the bay into a boiling cauldron of fire and death, their roars echoing a final end to the age of slavery in the region. With her authority in Essos now absolute, the last piece of her puzzle sailed into her harbor. Yara and Theon Greyjoy, fugitives from their own murderous uncle, arrived with what remained of the Iron Fleet. They offered Daenerys the ships she desperately needed to transport her vast army across the sea, asking in return only for her help in reclaiming their own throne and the independence of the Iron Islands. An alliance was forged, uniting the dragon and the kraken, with the brilliant political mind of Tyrion Lannister as her newly appointed hand. The spymaster Varys secured alliances with the vengeful houses of Dorne and the Reach, and with an unprecedented army at her back, Daenerys was finally ready. Her long pilgrimage in Essos concluded with the monumental image of her armada, a coalition of unsullied Dothraki and Ironborn sailing west. Her dragons soared above the fleet, their shadows stretching across the waves toward a continent that had forgotten the meaning of their fire. Winter had officially come to Westeros, a stark and literal truth that signaled the beginning of the end. The intricate political games that had cost so many lives were about to be rendered meaningless by the existential threat gathering in the far north. Yet the realm was more fractured than ever. In Winterfell, Jon Snow, the reluctant king in the north, desperately tried to prepare his people for a war against the dead, a concept so fantastical that most could not grasp its reality. In King's Landing, Queen Cersei, alone on her iron throne, ruled a kingdom of fear, her only policy the threat of annihilation for any who dared oppose her. And now sailing toward their shores was Daenerys Targaryen, a claimant with a legitimate blood right, an unstoppable army, and 3 weapons of mass destruction. The game had produced not 1 but 3 monarchs, each with a claim they believed absolute. The wars to come would not just determine who would sit the Iron Throne, but whether a throne would even exist when the long night was over. The great wheel of power, which had crushed so many beneath its weight, was spinning faster than ever, and its final destination was terrifyingly unknown. When Daenerys Targaryen finally returned to the land of her birth, stepping onto the black volcanic sands of Dragonstone. The moment was heavy with the weight of prophecy and history. This was the place she had been born during a raging storm, the ancient seat of her family, and it felt as if the very stones of the castle had been waiting for her. She gathered her war council in the chamber of the painted table, a room dominated by a massive carved map of Westeros. Around her sat a coalition of some of the most formidable minds in the world. Tyrion, with his unparalleled strategic and political acumen. Varys, with his network of secrets that could unravel any opponent. And Olenna Tyrell, the Queen of Thorns, whose bitter experience had taught her every dirty trick in the game. Their strategy was a masterclass in modern warfare, designed to conquer a continent with precision and minimal collateral damage, thereby winning the hearts of the people. They would use their Westerosi allies, the armies of Dorne, and the Reach, to encircle King's Landing, starving the capital into submission. Simultaneously, the Unsullied, her elite infantry, would strike a crippling blow to Lannister morale and wealth by capturing their ancestral home, the supposedly impregnable fortress of Casterly Rock. All the while, Daenerys and her dragons would remain a terrifying threat held in reserve, a final move to be deployed only as a last resort. It was a brilliant, logical, and thoroughly civilized plan for a conquest, and it was doomed to fail spectacularly the moment it collided with the brutal reality of Cersei Lannister's Westeros. Hundreds of leagues to the north, Jon Snow was grappling with the harsh realities of leadership. A raven arrived from Sam Tarly at the Citadel, carrying a discovery of immense strategic importance. A massive deposit of dragonglass, one of the only known substances capable of killing White Walkers, was located beneath the island fortress of Dragonstone. The problem was that Dragonstone was now the seat of Daenerys Targaryen, a queen with a fearsome reputation, who would undoubtedly demand fealty in exchange for this vital resource. Leaving the north at such a critical time was a tremendous risk, but the threat of the dead outweighed all other concerns. Entrusting Sansa with the preparations for the coming winter, Jon sailed south. A king traveling to meet a queen, venturing into the lair of dragons to beg for the weapons that could save the world. The first meeting between the wolf and the dragon was a clash of wills as cold and hard as the stones of the ancient castle. Daenerys, accustomed to lords vying for her favor, expected Jon to kneel. Jon, having faced horrors she could not imagine, had no intention of bending the knee to any southern ruler. They stood on opposite sides of the throne room, two monarchs from different worlds, their pride and conviction forming an almost visible barrier between them. It was Tyrion Lannister who acted as the reluctant bridge. Having known and respected Jon from his time at the Wall, and having earned Daenerys' trust through shared struggle, he carefully began to mediate between the forces of ice and fire, knowing that their alliance was the realm's only hope. The proof Jon needed was found deep within the mountain. In a dark cavern, ancient cave paintings depicted a forgotten history. The children of the forest and the first men, ancient enemies standing side by side, united against the same inhuman foe, the White Walkers. The carvings were undeniable evidence of the threat Jon had been describing. But just as Daenerys was beginning to believe him, her own meticulously planned war began to unravel with stunning speed. Cersei's new ally, the pirate King Euron Greyjoy, ambushed and destroyed Yara fleet, capturing Illyria Sand and the Sand Snakes, and delivering them to King's Landing. There, Cersei enacted a particularly cruel revenge, forcing Illyria to watch her own daughter die from the same poison she had used on Myrcella. At the same time, Jaime Lannister, in a brilliant strategic feint, abandoned Casterly Rock to the Unsullied, instead marching the bulk of his army south to sack Highgarden. The Tyrell seat fell, its vast wealth ceased to pay off the crown debts, and its matriarch, Olenna, chose to die by poison. But with her last breath, the Queen of Thorns delivered a final devastating blow, confessing to Jaime that it was she who had poisoned Joffrey, a truth designed to drive a wedge of doubt between him and Cersei. Frustrated by these catastrophic defeats and Tyrion's failing strategies, Daenerys decided to unleash the full force of her power. She personally led a Dothraki horde, with Drogon soaring overhead, in a surprise attack on the Lannister army as it returned from Highgarden. The battle known as the Loot Train Attack was not a battle at all. It was an annihilation. Drogon fire turned ranks of soldiers into screaming torches and melted armor into slag, while the Dothraki riders swept through the terrified survivors like a force of nature. Watching his army burn, Jaime Lannister knew he was witnessing the end of an era. In a desperate, suicidal act of courage, he charged directly at Daenerys. He was saved from certain incineration only at the last second. In the aftermath, the surviving Lannister soldiers were given a choice: bend the knee or die. Lord Randall Tarly and his son Dickon, bound by their oath to Cersei, refused. Daenerys, seeking to make an example, had Drogon execute them with a blast of fire, a brutal demonstration of the price of defiance that sent a clear and terrifying message to all the lords of Westeros. Even as the great wars raged in the south, a quieter, more profound event was taking place in the north. The Starks were finally coming home. Bran arrived first, but he was no longer the boy who had fallen from the tower. He was now the three-eyed raven, a vessel for all the memories of the world, a being so detached from his own past that his siblings found him a near stranger. Then came Arya. She was no longer the wild girl who had chased cats through the castle. She returned as a lethal assassin, her face a mask she could change at will, her hands instruments of death. The joyous reunion of the scattered pack was tempered by the chilling realization of how much each of them had been irrevocably changed by their ordeals. Petter Baelish, ever the schemer, saw their reunion not as a family healing, but as an opportunity for manipulation. He attempted to play the sisters against each other, planting seeds of doubt and suspicion, hoping to turn them into his puppets. For a time, his plan seemed to be working, as old resentments and new traumas created a palpable tension between Sansa and Arya. But Littlefinger made a fatal error. He underestimated the strength of their bond forged in shared loss. Working together, the Stark siblings, Sansa with her political cunning, Arya with her lethal skills, and Bran with his all-seeing knowledge, unraveled his web of lies. In the great hall of Winterfell, before the Lords of the North and the Vale, they exposed him for the traitor he was. The man who had ignited the War of the Five Kings and betrayed their father met his end at the tip of Arya Valyrian's steel dagger. With Littlefinger gone, their attention turned to the greater, more urgent threat. Jon and Daenerys understood that Queen Cersei would never agree to a truce to fight the army of the dead without irrefutable proof of its existence. This led to a desperate, almost suicidal plan. A small party would venture beyond the wall to capture a White and bring it back to King's Landing. The group that undertook this mission was a fellowship of hardened survivors and unlikely heroes. Tormund Giantsbane, the wildling warrior; Beric Dondarrion, the man who could not die; Thoros of Myr, the priest who brought him back; Jorah Mormont, the loyal knight seeking to prove his worth; Sandor Clegane, the hound, facing his fears for a cause greater than himself; and Gendry, the royal bastard, running toward danger instead of away from it. They succeeded in capturing a single White, but the creature's unearthly screams brought the entire army of the dead down upon them. Trapped on a small island in the center of a frozen lake, surrounded by a legion of the dead, their situation seemed hopeless. Thoros of Myr was mauled to death by a white bear, and the others prepared for a final doomed stand. But a message had been sent. Daenerys, receiving Gendry Raven on Dragonstone, flew north with all 3 of her dragons. The sight of them descending from the sky, breathing colossal jets of fire that tore through the ranks of the dead, was a vision of myth made real. But the battle brought a devastating shock. The Night King, with supernatural strength and precision, hurled an ice spear that struck Viserion. The dragon plummeted from the sky, crashing through the ice into the frozen lake below. Daenerys watched in horror as one of her children, a creature she believed invincible, was killed. As Daenerys escaped with the survivors, Jon was left behind, only to be saved at the last moment by the return of his long-lost uncle, Benjen Stark, who sacrificed himself to ensure Jon's survival. Jon returned to the wall with the captured White, the proof they needed to convince the South of the coming apocalypse. But the cost of that proof was catastrophic. The Night King had lost hundreds of his Whites, but he had gained a dragon, Meeting in the dragon pit of King's Landing was a gathering of ghosts and mortal enemies, a tense summit between people who had spent years trying to destroy one another. On one side sat Queen Circe, flanked by the monstrous, silent form of the mountain. On the other, Daenerys Targaryen, whose dragons circled ominously overhead. Between them stood Jon Snow, no longer just a king, but an emissary for all the living, trying to convey the scale of a threat that dwarfed their human squabbles. The proof they had brought back was more effective than any speech. When the hound kicked open the crate, the captured white lunged forward, a screeching, mindless engine of death, making straight for Circe. Even after Jon hacked it to pieces with his Valyrian steel sword, its severed parts continued to writhe and claw. The sight was so viscerally horrifying that not even the cynical Queen Circe could deny it. She pledged her armies to the Great War, promising a truce until the army of the dead was defeated. But it was a lie. Another calculated move in her endless game. Her true plan, she later revealed to Jaime, was to let her enemies exhaust themselves fighting the dead in the north, leaving her to rule over the ashes. This final, profound act of treachery was the one that finally broke Jaime Lannister. He had stood by her through everything: incest, murder, mass destruction. But to betray all of humanity for the sake of her own power was a line even he could not cross. As the first snowflakes began to fall on King's Landing, Jaime turned his back on his sister, his queen, and his lover, and rode north alone, a man finally choosing honor over a toxic and destructive love. On the sea voyage north, the alliance between Jon and Daenerys deepened into something more personal. The king in the north and the dragon queen became lovers, an unwitting fulfillment of the ancient prophecy of ice and fire. Their union held the promise of a powerful new future for the realm, but it was also built on a secret that threatened to undo everything. At that very moment in Winterfell, Bran Stark and Samwell Tarly were piecing together the last parts of the puzzle. Through Bran visions and a Maester forgotten diary, they confirmed the truth. Jon was not Ned Stark bastard. He was Aegon Targaryen, the legitimate son of Rhaegar Targaryen, and Lyanna Stark, who had been secretly married. He was the true and rightful heir to the Iron Throne, a revelation that would inevitably complicate and perhaps destroy his new relationship with the woman who was unknowingly his aunt. But all these human dramas, love, succession, betrayal, were rendered insignificant by the events unfolding at the Wall. The Night King, now mounted on the reanimated corpse of Viserion, arrived at Eastwatch by the sea. The dragon, once a creature of life giving fire, now breathed a torrent of blue supernatural flame, its complete opposite. The ancient ice of the Wall, which had stood for 8,000 years as the shield of the realms of men, cracked, groaned, and then collapsed into the sea. The magical barrier that had protected the living for millennia was gone. Through the newly created breach, the army of the dead began its march south. Winter had broken through the gates. The era of petty conflicts was over. The feuds between noble houses, the game of crowns and titles that had soaked the soil of Westeros in blood, were about to be rendered meaningless. Winter had ceased to be a coming season. It was now a present and brutal reality, and it had brought with it an enemy that could not be bought, reasoned with, or intimidated. The Night King army did not fight for land or power. It fought to extinguish the very concept of life, and its ranks swelled with every soul it claimed. The question was no longer who would sit on the Iron Throne, but whether anyone would be left to see another spring. This singular, terrifying truth was what brought the world to Winterfell. The ancient stronghold of the Starks became the last great bastion of the living. Its stone halls and courtyards overflowing with an unprecedented coalition of strangers. The disciplined, unsullied, stoic, and silent stood in perfect formations that seemed carved from the very rock of the castle. The Dothraki, fierce horsemen who had never before seen snow, huddled by fires, their unfamiliar language a stark contrast to the clipped tones of the Northerners. And the Knights of the Vale, with their gleaming armor and proud banners, prepared themselves to fight an enemy that defied all the rules of chivalry and warfare they had ever known. Amidst the tension of this gathering, moments of reunion felt like small sparks of warmth in a gathering blizzard. By the quiet weirwood tree, Jon Snow and Arya Stark embraced for the first time since they were children. The years of hardship and horror were etched on both their faces. But when she showed him the small sword needle, it was a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had survived everything. He had given her a weapon, and in doing so, had given her the means to endure. Nearby, Sandor Clegane found Arya as well, and saw not the lost girl he had once grudgingly protected, but a woman who had become as cold and dangerous as himself. In the castle forges, the air rang with the sound of hammers as Gendry, no longer a simple apprentice, worked tirelessly. He was shaping blades, not from common steel, but from the black volcanic glass that was one of their only hopes. Each finished weapon, a small prayer against the coming night. Overshadowing these personal moments was a secret of dynastic, world-altering importance, a truth that threatened to shatter the fragile new alliance. In the cold, silent crypts of Winterfell, surrounded by the stone figures of his ancestors, Samwell Tarly finally told Jon the truth. He was not Jon Snow, the bastard of Winterfell. He was Aegon Targaryen, the legitimate son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, and the rightful heir to the Iron Throne. His entire life, his very identity, had been a lie, a carefully constructed shield to protect him from a world that would have seen his birth as a threat. The revelation struck him like a physical blow, casting his newfound love for Daenerys, his aunt, in a complicated and unsettling new light. But there was no time for the personal and political political fallout of this truth. The army of the dead was almost at their gates, and the future of the world depended on the battles of the next few days, not the succession of a throne that might soon be buried under snow. Into this tense atmosphere walked Jaime Lannister, a lone figure arriving from the south. He was a living shadow of the conflicts that had led them to this point. The arrogant Kingslayer was gone, replaced by a weary, humbled man seeking to honor a promise. His first act was to stand before Bran Stark, the boy he had crippled, the one person who knew the true depth of his past sins. There were no grand apologies, only a quiet acknowledgement of the man he had been and the man he was trying to become. Later that evening, in a moment of rare calm, Jaime performed an act that would have been unthinkable in the old world. Gathered by the warmth of a hearth with a small group of companions, he took his sword and, in a simple ceremony, fulfilled a lifelong dream. He knighted Brienne of Tarth. In the eyes of gods and men, the woman who had embodied the truest spirit of honor her entire life finally received the title she had more than earned, given to her by the man who understood better than anyone the heavy cost of oaths, both broken and kept. In the final hours before the world end, as a suffocating dread settled over Winterfell, people sought small moments of life and meaning. Arya Stark, the girl who had spent years being trained to become a nameless instrument of death, made a final choice to be human. With the world on the edge of destruction, she chose to spend her last night not as an assassin, but as a woman, finding warmth and connection with Gendry. It was a defiant act of living in the face of an all-consuming death. When the army of the dead finally arrived, it was not with the sound of trumpets or the roar of a traditional army, but with the chilling, unnatural silence of a blizzard. They came as a wave of absolute cold, a creeping darkness that swallowed the horizon. The first response from the living was a magnificent, doomed charge. The entire Dothraki horde, their curved blades set ablaze by Melisandre's magic, rode out to meet the enemy. A breathtaking river of fire flowing into the blackness, but the darkness consumed them. One by one, their lights were snuffed out, their war cries silenced until nothing remained but an unnerving void. The fiercest warriors in the world had been erased in moments. What followed was a storm of chaos breaking against the walls of Winterfell. The dead poured over the battlements like a relentless tide, their sheer numbers overwhelming the defenders. Undead giants, their eyes burning with a cold blue light, smashed at the castle gates. In the midst of the slaughter, small acts of impossible courage shone through. Lyanna Mormont, the child leader of Bear Island, faced down one of these giants. As the creature lifted her from the ground, crushing the life from her body, she used her last breath to drive a dragonglass dagger into its eye, felling the monster with her final act of defiance. Above the carnage on the ground, a different war raged in the sky. Daenerys and Jon, riding Drogon and Rhaegal, engaged their fallen brother, the undead Viserion, in a chaotic aerial dance of fire and ice. The storm was so thick with snow and ash that it was nearly impossible to tell friend from foe. When Daenerys finally saw a clear opening and unleashed Drogon's full fury upon the Night King himself, the moment that should have ended the war became a moment of pure horror. The dragon fire, a force that had melted steel and stone, simply washed over the Night King, leaving him utterly unharmed. He was not a creature of the living world, and he was not subject to its laws. As the battle turned against them, the living were forced back within the castle walls, their lines breaking under the infinite pressure of the dead. The fighting became a desperate close-quarters struggle in the very courtyards and halls where the Starks had grown up. Beric Dondarrion, the man who had cheated death 6 times, finally met his end, protecting Arya from a horde of whites, his purpose finally fulfilled. In the heart of the chaos, Melisandre found Arya. The Red Priestess, her face illuminated by the fires of a failing world, looked into the young assassin eyes and repeated a prophecy from long ago. Brown eyes, green eyes, and blue eyes. In that moment, Arya, lifetime of training, her list, her quest for vengeance, it all snapped into a single clear purpose. She was the weapon meant for this exact moment. As the battle for Winterfell reached its desperate final moments, the Night King, untouched and implacable, made his way to the heart of the castle, the Godswood. There, Bran Stark waited, the living repository of the world memory, the ultimate target in the Night King war against humanity itself. Theon Greyjoy, in a final redemptive act, stood as the last line of defense. The man who had once betrayed the Starks and seized their home now gave his life to protect it, charging the Night King in a last brave and hopeless stand. He died with a courage that washed away the sins of his past, a Stark in spirit, if not in name. The Night King stepped over Theon's body and approached Bran, his movements deliberate, his victory seemingly absolute. The air grew still. The chaos of the battle seemed to fade into a muffled background hum. Then, in a silent blur, Arya Stark launched herself out of the darkness, a Valyrian steel dagger in her hand. The Night King, with a speed that defied his icy calm, caught her in midair, his grip closing around her throat. Her weapon clattered to the ground. For a heart-stopping second, it seemed she had failed. But the girl who had been trained by the world's deadliest assassins had learned more than just how to kill. She had learned how to deceive, how to misdirect, how to turn an opponent's strength against them. In a move so swift, it was almost invisible. She dropped the dagger from her captured hand into her free one, and with a final desperate lunge, plunged the blade deep into the Night King chest. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The Night King did not scream or fall. He shattered, exploding into a cloud of ice and shadow. In that same instant, across the entire battlefield, his lieutenants, The other White Walkers disintegrated in the same way, and with their destruction, the magic that animated their army of the dead was broken. The Whites, the reanimated corpses of men, giants, and horses, collapsed where they stood, their blue eyes fading to black, their bodies once again just lifeless clay. The great suffocating silence of the long night was broken by the first rays of a weary, wounded dawn. Victory had been won, but the cost was staggering. The fields and courtyards of Winterfell were littered with the bodies of the fallen, a testament to the price of survival. Sir Jorah Mormont, the loyal knight who had followed his queen through fire and exile, died on the battlefield, protecting her. And as the sun rose, Melisandre, her long, mysterious purpose finally complete, removed her magical necklace and walked out into the snow, her ancient body crumbling to dust in the morning light. The living had won the war for the dawn, but the world they had saved would be forever haunted by the ghosts of those who had died to protect it. With the army of the dead vanquished, the fragile alliance of the living shattered almost immediately, giving way to the final bitter conflict, the last war. For Daenerys Targaryen, the victory at Winterfell had been Pyrrhic, a victory paid for with the lives of her closest friends and a significant portion of her army. Her grief and losses had worn her down, leaving her teetering on the edge of the very ruthlessness she had always tried to control. The final push came with an unexpected ambush. As her fleet sailed south, Euron Greyjoy's ships appeared from behind a headland, their massive scorpion crossbows filling the sky with iron bolts. Rhaegal, her green dragon, was struck multiple times and crashed into the sea. His death, a visceral, shocking blow. Daenerys had come to Westeros with 3 dragons, her children of fire. Now only one remained. The strategic loss was compounded by a deeply personal one. Her closest confidante, Missandei, was captured in the attack and taken to King's Landing. In a calculated act of psychological warfare, Cersei had Missandei executed on the city walls, ensuring Daenerys was there to watch. With her last breath, Missandei uttered a single word, a final command to her queen, Dracarys. It was the high Valyrian word for dragonfire, a plea for retribution that was designed to ignite the Targaryen fury Cersei had so recklessly provoked. As Daenerys spiraled into a storm of grief and rage, Jon Snow struggled to maintain a semblance of reason and unity. But his own world was unraveling. The secret of his parentage, a truth with the power to reshape the entire political landscape, could not be contained. He had told Sansa, who in turn told Tyrion, who then confided in Varys. The knowledge that Jon Snow was in fact Aegon Targaryen, the true heir to the Iron Throne with a stronger claim than Daenerys, spread like a poison through the allied camp, creating fractures and whispered conspiracies at the very moment they needed to be united. In the midst of this escalating tension, Jaime Lannister made his own fateful choice. Having fought honorably for the living at Winterfell, he heard of Cersei's impending doom and found he could not abandon her. Brienne, heartbroken, pleaded with him to stay, to be the good man he had finally become. But the twisted, all-consuming bond he shared with his twin was a force more powerful than honor or reason. He chose to return to King's Landing to be with Cersei at the end, a man surrendering to the love that had both defined and destroyed his life. The final assault on King's Landing was a cataclysm. Daenerys, mounted on the back of Drogon, descended upon the city as an avatar of vengeance. The formidable Iron Fleet was reduced to a flotilla of burning wreckage in minutes. The city's giant scorpion defenses, designed to kill dragons, were incinerated before they could even be properly aimed. The famed Golden Company, the mercenary army Cersei had hired to defend her, was annihilated from behind, their disciplined ranks breaking in a terror-fueled rout. When the city defenders, seeing the hopelessness of their situation, rang the bells of surrender, the fighting should have stopped. The city was won. But for Daenerys, standing on the precipice of her lifelong ambition, the sound of the bells was not a signal of victory. It was a trigger for a terrible release. The cumulative weight of her betrayals, her losses, and her grief finally broke her. She ignored the surrender and unleashed Drogon upon the city itself. What was meant to be a liberation became a firestorm. The streets her ancestors had built ran with molten stone and the screams of the innocent. Jon Snow and his men, horrified, could only watch as the queen they had followed became the very thing she had sworn to destroy. Amidst the inferno, personal reckonings reached their violent conclusions. In the crumbling Red Keep, the two Clegane brothers, Sandor and Gregor, finally had their long-awaited duel. Their fight was a brutal, desperate struggle, ending only when the Hound tackled his monstrous brother, sending them both plunging from a high tower into the fires below. The feud that had begun with fire in their childhood ended with it in their deaths. Jaime, navigating the collapsing castle, finally found Cersei, alone and terrified, in the map room where they had once plotted to rule the world. As the foundations gave way and the ancient stones rained down around them, they held each other one last time. The twins who had come into the world together and whose forbidden love had set in motion the ruin of their house died together in the darkness beneath their fallen kingdom. After the fires had died down, Daenerys walked into the ruined throne room. Snow drifted down through the shattered roof, dusting the Iron Throne, the object of obsession that had cost so many lives. She stood before it triumphant and spoke to Jon of the new beautiful world she would build, a world liberated by fire, a world that would bend to her will. Jon, looking at the woman he loved, saw only a tyrant born from her own pain. With a heart torn between love and a terrible duty, he pulled her into a final embrace. And as he kissed her, he drove a dagger into her heart. The mother of dragons died in his arms. Her dream of a new world turned to ash along with the city she had just conquered. The roar of grief that tore from Dragon's throat was a sound of pure world-ending agony. Finding his mother's lifeless body, the last dragon did not turn his rage on her killer. Instead, he unleashed a torrent of fire upon the object that had caused all her suffering. The Iron Throne, the symbol of power and conquest that had driven generations of men to madness, was melted into a twisted, unrecognizable ruin of slag. Then, gently, the great beast took Daenerys's body in his claws and flew away, disappearing into the eastern sky, leaving behind a broken world to reckon with the consequences of its games. In the charred ruins of the Dragon Pit, a great council convened, a gathering of the surviving lords and ladies of Westeros to face the monumental task of building a new world from the ashes of the old. From his chains, a captive Tyrion Lannister made an impassioned plea. He spoke of the endless bloody cycle of ambition and inheritance, arguing that the future could not be entrusted to another powerful family, another heir born to rule. They needed a different kind of leader, one whose claim was not based on birthright, but on wisdom. His choice was as unexpected as it was revolutionary. Bran Stark, the boy who could not walk, but who could see all of history, the man who held the memory of the world within him. Bran the Broken, as Tyrion named him, was chosen not for his strength or his desire for power, for he had none, but for his story and his unique ability to learn from the mistakes of the past. In this new order, however, some old lines could not be erased. Sansa Stark, now the pragmatic and resilient Lady of Winterfell, stood before her brother, the king, and declared the North independence. Her people had bled too much and suffered too long under the rule of southern kings. They would be a free and sovereign kingdom once more, and she would be their queen. For Jon Snow, the hero who had saved the world, and the Queenslayer who had ended a tyranny, there was no easy place in this new world. As a compromise to appease the remaining loyalists of Daenerys, he was sentenced to rejoin the Night's Watch. But this was an exile in name only. The wall was no longer a shield against the dead, but a porous border, and the Watch was no longer a penal colony. When Jon rode north, leading the free folk back into the true North, it was not as a punishment, but as a homecoming. He was finally leaving the world of politics and thrones behind, heading into the wild lands where he had always truly belonged. His sister Arya also chose a path of her own making. The world of Westeros, with its courts and its castles, was too small for her now. She boarded a ship and sailed west past the edge of all known maps, an explorer seeking a world beyond the one that had tried so hard to break her. The girl who had been forged by a list of names to kill now sought a future that was unwritten. The great grinding wheel of power that Daenerys had vowed to break had not been shattered by dragonfire, but by a quiet revolution of ideas. The hereditary monarchy was gone, replaced by an elected king who would rule over 6 kingdoms, while a 7th stood proudly independent. It was a fragile, imperfect system built on the hope that memory and reason could triumph over strength and bloodlust. The Game of Thrones was over. The great wars were done, but life in its quiet and persistent way would continue. People would rebuild. New families would rise, and children would be born into a world that might, with time, forget the names of the tyrants and heroes who had fought for its future. Wounds would heal, and new scars would form. But the stories, the epic, tragic, and beautiful tales of their age would endure. Songs would be sung of the dragon queen who broke chains and burned cities, of the bastard who became a king and gave up a crown, and of the girl who faced down the long night and saved the world. And in the telling of those stories, the souls of all who had played the game would live forever.